Well, I want to talk about persecution, Christian persecution. And we have covered this in the past, but I think at times we, quite frankly, don't do the topic much service by not taking it a little bit deeper. I'm very honored to have with us Nik Ripken, and he's authored a book called The Insanity of God, a true story of faith resurrected. There's a picture of it there on the screen, put out by B&H Books, and let me encourage you to check it out at Evangel or Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Pretty fascinating story as we talk about him and his wife. They have been over 30 years now working overseas as Christian workers. And during those years, they and their 3 sons have served in Eastern and Southern Africa, the Horn of Africa, and throughout the Muslim world. So, Nik, nice to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You know, this whole subject of Christian persecution, we're starting to feel a little bit of it here in America, but unlike anything that is going on around the world, give us a little bit of perspective of how many believers literally live with this day in and day out.
Well, it's hard to measure. I mean, I've heard stuff that my friend Paul Marshall has written, and he says that 80% of the believers who practice their faith are under, moderate to severe persecution. But I think it'd be safe to say that across the planet, where people are practicing their faith, leading significant numbers of people to Christ, that the persecution is always a byproduct of people coming to Christ. So the more people that come to Christ, like in Acts chapter 2, the more widespread the persecution is going to be. The less people coming to Christ, persecution may not be noticeable.
Well, we've heard these stories, and we've also witnessed the fact that we know that the underground church in China for years was heavily persecuted, still is in some ways. And but when they finally got in there, they found a very healthy church. In other words, it grew under persecution. And so from that, you've made the statement that you think the persecution should never end.
Yeah, and it's not that I like it, and it's not that we just blow it off as something easy, but we've taken a lot of heat by saying that the number one cause of persecution is people coming to Jesus. And if the church has been sort of brainwashed to pray for persecution to stop, the only way we understand that it can stop is that God stops people from coming to the Son. And so it's not excusing the people who nailed Jesus to the cross. It's just a recognition that faith in Jesus always elicits a demonic response because Satan just hates to give up his territory.
You yourself have witnessed and experienced persecution and personal loss. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Well, I can tell you that in Somalia itself, I was shot at a number of times, but I think that was more due to just being a relief worker and being an object of ransom or, kidnapping and all that. But it's not that I'm haunted by it, but there's some scars that only heaven will heal. But on the day that they killed 4 of my best friends in Somalia who were converts to Jesus, walked up behind them, put a gun to their head, and then hid their bodies to where we today don't know where they are. That was just a really tough day that I fought with the Lord a lot. And then when Tim, our middle son, woke us up in the middle of the night on Easter Sunday morning, a week after his 16th birthday, with a severe asthma attack that he didn't survive. And just sort of all there back in 1997, all in just a matter of months, believers in Somalia were all but wiped out. Timmy died, and my wife's Ruth's mother died. That was just a really hard and dark time for us.
All right. How has this affected your faith? I mean, I know you're still at it, and you've interviewed a lot of people that have been persecuted, and you have seen it and suffered it and experienced it in your family. It's got to affect your faith in some way.
Well, I never doubted that God loved me all those years in Somalia, but what I had to stop quoting or praying is greater is he that's in me than he that's in the world, because there wasn't any evidence of that. And that's why we went to believers in persecution across the world to see indeed what does the global body of Christ look like. And what we have found is when there's a critical mix of believers, when there's actually a functioning body of Christ that's really biblically sound, then we find just unbelievable victory over any kind of persecution. But when you've just got scattered believers, they're just a few, they're alone and they're afraid as well as scattered, and there's no real body of Christ to walk along with you, to learn from you, to teach you, to suffer with you, to take care of your family. What we find the difference is in persecution is if you want to have a victorious experience through persecution and grow through it, it takes the body of Christ going through that together. And in Somalia, we never had a functioning body of Christ. And so globally, my goodness, it's amazing what God is doing. There are still places on the planet that Satan is holding on to just with tenacity. And everyone that comes to Christ pays a big price. And in some of these places, we don't have a critical mix, a critical mass of believers enough to say, hey, we've got enough to call this the body of Christ that can walk through persecution together to grow.
With the variety of persecution you've seen and witnessed, do you see any commonality?
Oh, we see quite a bit of commonality. We, without sounding like I'm a country boy from Kentucky, and I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing or anything,
right.
But when persecution comes from the government, when it comes from outside the family, there's a lot more opportunity for the body of Christ to explode and for the church to grow until it's so strong the government feels under threat. Now that's just a general classification, but when your persecutor is sitting at your breakfast table or it's in the bedroom next to you, when it comes from the bottom up, so to speak, from your family rather than the top down from government, it's just much, much harder for the church to overcome that initial persecution. So when the persecutor is your family, we really have to have a biblical image in our mind that we must reach the entire family to Christ and plant a church in that home. Otherwise, if it's just a son or a daughter or a wife or even a husband that comes to Christ by themselves, the persecution from the family is just so horrific that it's hard, almost impossible to survive by yourself isolated like that.
Wow.
And so if it comes from the government, that gives you some freedom, to see sometimes even thousands of house churches planted. When persecution comes from your mother, your father, your brother, your uncle, that persecutor is sitting at your breakfast table, that makes it really tough.
Your subtitle to your book, The Insanity of God, A True Story of Faith Resurrected. What would you, and how would you describe in the book there, resurrection faith? What do you mean by that?
Well, of course, you've already touched on it a little bit. When we sort of left with our heads down and hearts broken in 1997, it was just a time of, as my wife says, we just came back to the States, and college students and people that loved us began to put us back together piece by piece. And it might have been counterintuitive, but going among believers in the former Soviet Union and going all across China, working my way back through believers in house churches, primarily in Buddhism and Hinduism, we just found faith that was so contagious, and faith that was planting churches while they're in prison, faith that, like in China, they consider being in prison their theological education. It was just, we found the body of Christ so vibrant, and we learned from sitting at the feet of believers in persecution what was not in the DNA, for instance, in Somalia. We didn't have a critical mix of believers. They were just too few in numbers. There were almost no women. There were almost no whole families.
Wow.
And so there just wasn't enough there for the resurrection really to be experienced among, because there was no body. There were just body parts.
Well, Nick, you're inspiring. The book is entitled The Insanity of God, The True Story of Resurrection Faith by Nik Ripken. You may want to check it out at B&H Books. Take a look at it at Evangel or maybe Barnes & Noble or Amazon. Nick, thank you, and our prayers go with you. Thanks for your courage and sharing your story, and God bless you. Keep up the good work, my friend.
Thank you, my brother. You really have been a great gift to us today.
All right. Blessings to you.